I was 25 years old when I first saw Edward Harrington standing in the doorway of my schoolroom, and I remember thinking how out of place he looked among the worn wooden desks and chalk dust that had become my entire world. If you find comfort in stories of quiet longing and patient hearts, I hope you'll stay with me through this one. The autumn light fell across his dark coat in a way that made him seem almost unreal, like a figure from one of the illustrated books I sometimes showed the children on special occasions. He did not speak at first, only stood there observing the rows of miners' children bent over their slates, their small fingers gripping pieces of chalk with the same determination their fathers used to grip their tools below ground. I had been in the middle of a lesson on arithmetic, writing numbers on the blackboard in careful columns, and I felt my hand hesitate mid-stroke under his gaze. "Miss Collins," he said finally, his voice carrying the educated accent of London, though I would later learn he had spent most of his childhood in Yorkshire before being sent away to school. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Mr. Harrington," I replied, setting down my chalk and brushing the white powder from my fingers onto my apron. I had known he might come eventually. His family's company owned the coal mines that employed nearly every father and brother in our village, and it was his family's charitable fund that paid my modest salary and kept the school open. Still, knowing he might appear and actually seeing him there were entirely different matters. He asked if he might observe the lessons for a time, and I agreed because I could hardly refuse him. He took a seat at the back of the room on one of the benches we used during assemblies, folding his tall frame onto the rough wood with a kind of careful grace. I returned to my teaching, though I was conscious of his presence in a way that made me stumble over words I had spoken 100 times before. The children noticed, of course. Children always notice when something is different, when the rhythm of their days has been altered. We were studying the kings and queens of England that afternoon, and I had drawn a rough timeline on the blackboard showing the Tudor dynasty. Little Thomas Fletcher, who was 8 and sharp as a tack despite having been born with a clubfoot that kept him from the mines, raised his hand and asked why Henry VIII had needed so many wives. It was the sort of question that could lead down complicated paths, but I had learned to navigate such inquiries with care. He wanted a son, I explained, to inherit his throne and continue his line. In those days, people believed only a son could rule the kingdom properly. "That seems foolish," said Mary Dawson, who was 10 and the brightest student I had ever taught. "Queen Elizabeth ruled well enough, didn't she?" "She did indeed," I agreed, feeling a small swell of pride at her reasoning. Sometimes what people believe and what is true are not the same thing. I heard a soft sound from the back of the room that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. When I glanced at Edward Harrington, he was looking at Mary with something like admiration in his expression. He stayed for the remainder of the afternoon, through our reading lesson and our brief study of geography, through the moments when I helped the younger children sound out their letters, and the times when I set the older ones to copying passages from our worn book. When the children finally filed out at 4 o'clock, their boots loud on the wooden floor and their voices rising in relief at being released, he remained seated. I began erasing the blackboard, aware that I should probably turn and address him properly, but uncertain what to say. The schoolroom felt different, with only the two of us in it, smaller somehow despite the empty desks. "You teach them well," he said at last. I turned, clutching the eraser in both hands. "I do my best. They deserve every opportunity we can give them. My mother believes education is wasted on mining families," he said, and there was something in his tone I could not quite identify. "She thinks it only makes them dissatisfied with their positions in life." "Then your mother and I would disagree," I replied, more sharply than I had intended. I felt heat rise in my cheek, but I did not look away. These children have minds as keen as any others. What they lack is opportunity, not ability. He stood then, and I realized how tall he truly was, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical strength despite his gentleman's clothes. But his eyes, which were a deep brown flecked with gold in the slanting afternoon light, held no anger at my impertinence. "I agree with you," he said quietly. "That is why I came today. I wanted to see what my family's money was supporting. I wanted to know if it was making any real difference." "And what have you concluded?" He smiled, and it transformed his entire face, softening the stern lines around his mouth. "That it is making more difference than I dared hope. That you are doing something rather remarkable here, Miss Collins." I did not know what to say to that, so I simply nodded and turned back to finish erasing the board. I heard him move toward the door, his footsteps measured and deliberate. "I wonder," he said, pausing at the threshold, "if I might visit again, to observe the progress of the students, of course." "Of course," I echoed, though we both knew it was not entirely about the students. He did come again, the following week, and then the week after that. He began arriving earlier, sometimes helping me prepare the room before the children arrived, carrying in firewood for the small stove that barely kept the chill from the air as autumn deepened into winter. He asked questions about my teaching methods, about the books I used, about the particular challenges each child faced. He listened to my answers with an attention that I had never experienced before, as though my words truly mattered, as though my thoughts on education and children and the future held weight. The children grew accustomed to his presence, and he grew easier with them in return. He helped Thomas Fletcher with his sums one afternoon when I was occupied with the younger students, and I watched from the corner of my eye as he patiently explained the concept of multiplication using small stones from the schoolyard. Thomas's face lit with understanding, and Edward looked as pleased as if he had accomplished something magnificent. "You would make a good teacher yourself," I told him later, after the children had gone and we were straightening the room together. "I rather doubt that," he said, stacking slates with careful precision. "I have none of your patience or your gift for explanation. You did well with Thomas today. Thomas is an exceptional boy. He should have opportunities beyond these." He gestured around the small schoolroom with its cracked windows and water-stained walls. "He will never have them," I said, and I could not keep the bitterness from my voice. "His father works in your family's mines. Thomas will work there too as soon as he is old enough. Clubfoot or not, no amount of education will change that." Edward set down the slates and turned to face me fully. What if it could? What if there were scholarships available, ways for exceptional students to continue their education? There are no such scholarships for children like these. There could be. I stared at him, trying to understand if he was serious or merely being kind. "Your family would never approve such a thing. You said yourself your mother thinks education wasted on them." "My mother does not control the family's charitable funds. My father does, and he is more open-minded than she. And in a few years, when he retires, the control will pass to me." It was the first time he had spoken of the future in a way that included me, even peripherally, and I felt something shift in my chest, like a door opening onto a room I had not known existed. We began to talk in earnest after that, not just about the children, but about everything. He told me about his years at Cambridge, about studying philosophy and literature, when his father had wanted him to focus on engineering and business. I told him about my own education, pieced together from charity school and long hours of reading by candlelight, about my father who had died in a mine collapse when I was 15, about my mother who had worked her fingers raw with washing to keep us fed until I was old enough to teach. He never flinched from these stories, never showed the discomfort that people of his class usually displayed when confronted with the realities of poverty. Instead, he listened with that same intense attention he brought to everything. And sometimes he asked questions that showed he truly understood what I was telling him. Winter came in earnest, and the schoolroom grew bitterly cold despite our best efforts. The children came wrapped in whatever warm clothing their families could spare, which was often precious little. I wore every petticoat I owned and still shivered as I taught. Edward began arriving earlier and earlier, building up the fire before the children came, bringing extra coal from his own supplies. One morning in late December, he arrived with an enormous parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside were wool scarves and mittens, enough for every child in the school. They were well made, clearly expensive, and I felt tears prick my eyes at the sight of them. "You cannot give these to them," I said, even as I wanted desperately to accept. "Why not? Their parents will have their pride. They will think it charity." "It is charity," he said simply, "but it is also practical. Children cannot learn when they are freezing. They will know the gifts came from you. Then I will say they came from the school fund, which is technically true. Please, Margaret." It was the first time he had used my given name, and hearing it in his voice did something strange to my heart. "Let me do this small thing." I agreed, and the joy on the children's faces when I distributed the scarves and mittens made any concern about pride seem small and petty. Mary Dawson wrapped her new scarf around her neck 3 times and beamed at me with such happiness that I had to turn away to hide my own emotion. Edward was standing by the window, looking out at the snow that had begun to fall, and when I approached him, he turned, and our eyes met with an understanding that needed no words. That afternoon, after the children had gone home wrapped in their new warmth, Edward asked if he might walk me to my lodgings. I lived in 2 small rooms above the baker's shop, and the walk was short, but I agreed. We moved slowly through the snow-covered streets, our breath making clouds in the cold air. "I have been thinking," he said as we walked, "about what you said regarding opportunities for students like Thomas and Mary. I have spoken to my father about establishing a proper scholarship fund." I stopped walking and turned to look at him. Snow was catching in his dark hair, melting almost immediately. Truly, he was more receptive than I anticipated. He said he had been considering something similar himself. Edward smiled slightly. "I think your work here has impressed more people than you realize. Word has spread about the quality of education you provide. I only do what any teacher should do." "No," he said firmly, "you do far more than that. You give these children hope. You show them that their minds matter, that they are capable of great things. That is not ordinary teaching, Margaret. That is something rare and precious." We had reached my lodgings, and I stood at the bottom of the external stairs that led to my rooms, suddenly reluctant to part from him. The snow was falling more heavily now, beginning to muffle the sounds of the village. "Will you come for Christmas dinner?" he asked abruptly. "My father is hosting a gathering, and he has asked me to invite you. He wants to meet the teacher who has made such an impression on the local children." I felt panic rise in my throat. I could not possibly. I would not know how to behave in such company. "You would behave exactly as yourself, which is more than sufficient." He took a step closer, and I could see the earnestness in his expression. "Please, I would very much like you to be there. Your mother will be there. Yes, she will not approve of my presence. Her approval is not required for every guest in my father's house." His voice was gentle but firm. "Will you come? For me? If not for the dinner itself?" I should have refused. I should have understood even then that accepting would set us both on a path that could only lead to difficulty. But I was 25 years old, and I had never felt the way I felt when I was near him. And so I said yes. The days leading up to Christmas were a torment of anxiety. I had one good dress, made over from a gown my mother had worked on years ago, and I spent my evenings altering it to be more current in style, though I had little idea what current style truly was. My landlady, Mrs. Shaw, who had a kind heart beneath her gruff manner, lent me her good shawl and helped me arrange my hair in a more sophisticated manner than my usual simple knot. On Christmas evening, Edward came to fetch me in his family's carriage, which caused every curtain on the street to twitch with curiosity. I felt sick with nerves as I climbed inside, acutely aware of how out of place I was in the elegant interior with its velvet seats and polished wood. "You look beautiful," Edward said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice steadied me somewhat. Harrington Hall was everything I had imagined and more, a great stone manor house set in extensive grounds, lit from every window against the winter darkness. Edward helped me down from the carriage and offered his arm, which I took with trembling fingers. We entered through massive doors into a hall that seemed to me as large as my entire school. There were perhaps 20 people gathered in the drawing room, all dressed in finery that made my altered dress seem shabby despite my best efforts. Edward's father, Lord Harrington, was a tall man with gray hair and a kind face, who greeted me warmly and engaged me in conversation about my teaching methods with genuine interest. But his wife, Lady Harrington, looked at me with eyes like chips of ice and offered the barest minimum of courtesy that politeness required. I tried to make myself invisible during dinner, speaking only when directly addressed, but Edward's father kept drawing me into the conversation. He asked about the children's progress, about what additional resources the school might need, about my thoughts on education reform. I answered as best I could, trying to match my speech to the formal cadence around me, acutely aware of Lady Harrington's cold stare from across the table. After dinner, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room while the men remained for port and cigars. I found myself seated near the fireplace, alone, while the other women clustered in groups and spoke of people and events about which I knew nothing. Lady Harrington approached me finally, and I stood quickly, my heart hammering. "Miss Collins," she said, her voice low enough that others could not hear, "I wonder if I might speak plainly with you." "Of course, Lady Harrington. My son has developed an interest in your school that I find concerning. He visits far more often than necessary, and now he has brought you here, into our home, among our friends and family." She paused, her cold eyes searching my face. "I hope you understand that any expectations you might be entertaining are entirely inappropriate." I felt heat flood my face, but I forced myself to meet her gaze. "I have no expectations, Lady Harrington. Your son has been generous in his support of the school, nothing more. I hope that is true. Edward has responsibilities, a position to maintain. He will marry someone suitable to his station, someone who can help him navigate society and manage his affairs. He needs a wife who understands the duties and obligations of his class." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "I am certain you understand this, being an educated woman. It would be cruel to allow any misunderstanding to continue." "I understand perfectly," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Good. Then we need not speak of this again." She turned away, rejoining the other ladies as though our conversation had been merely a pleasant exchange about the weather. I sat back down, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to stop their shaking. I knew she was right, of course. I had always known it, had known it from the first moment Edward Harrington stood in my schoolroom doorway. Whatever I felt for him, whatever he might feel for me, it was impossible. We existed in different worlds, separated by chasms of class and wealth that no amount of affection could bridge. When the men rejoined us, Edward came to my side immediately, his eyes searching my face. "Are you well? You look pale." "I have a slight headache," I said, which was not entirely a lie. "The rich food, perhaps. I am not accustomed to such dinners. Let me take you home." "No, please. I do not wish to interrupt the evening. I can call for a cab." "Don't be absurd." "Of course I will take you home." We made our excuses to his father, who looked concerned and kind, and to his mother, who looked satisfied in a way that made my stomach turn. The carriage ride back to my lodgings was quiet. Edward seemed to sense that something had happened, but he did not press me, for which I was grateful. At my door, he helped me down and walked me to the stairs. "Margaret," he said softly, "whatever my mother said to you—" "She said nothing that was not true," I interrupted. "I am grateful for all your family has done for the school, Mr. Harrington, but I think perhaps it would be better if you did not visit quite so often in future. People talk, and it is not good for either of our reputations." Even in the dim light from the street lamp, I could see the hurt that crossed his face. "Is that truly what you want?" "It is what is appropriate," I said, and then I turned and climbed the stairs before I could say anything more, before I could tell him that it was the last thing I wanted, that the thought of not seeing him made me feel as though something vital was being torn away. I cried that night for the first time since my father's death, muffling the sounds in my pillow so Mrs. Shaw would not hear. Edward did stay away for a time, though he sent regular notes about the scholarship fund he and his father were establishing, always keeping the tone strictly professional. The schoolroom felt empty without his presence, and I threw myself into my teaching with renewed intensity, as though I could somehow fill the gap his absence had created. January turned to February, and the cold deepened until the children's breath frosted in the air despite my best efforts with the stove. I was teaching a lesson on poetry one gray afternoon, reading aloud from Wordsworth, when the door opened and Edward entered. My voice caught mid-line, and I had to force myself to continue, to finish the stanza before acknowledging him. "Mr. Harrington," I said formally, setting down the book, "I was not expecting you. I apologize for the interruption." He looked thinner than I remembered, with shadows under his eyes. "I have news about the scholarship fund that I thought you should hear directly. Perhaps after the children have been dismissed. No, I think they should hear this as well." He turned to address the class, and I saw some of the children sit up straighter, particularly Thomas and Mary. "My father and I have established a fund that will provide full scholarships to 3 students from this school each year. The scholarships will cover tuition, books, and living expenses for grammar school, and if the student proves exceptional, for university study as well." The children stared at him in silence, not quite understanding what this meant. But I understood, and I felt tears begin to slip down my cheeks despite my best efforts to maintain composure. "Miss Collins will nominate students for consideration," Edward continued, "based on their academic merit and character. The first 3 scholarships will be awarded this spring to begin the following academic year." Mary Dawson's hand shot up. "Sir, could girls apply for these scholarships?" "Girls and boys both," Edward confirmed. "Academic ability is not limited by gender, as Miss Collins has taught you all." After the children were dismissed, buzzing with excitement and hope, I stood at the blackboard, unable to speak. Edward approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. "I should have asked your permission before announcing it to the children," he said quietly, "but I wanted them to hear it from me, to understand that it is real and binding." "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this?" "Because you were right. Because these children deserve every opportunity. Because education is not wasted on anyone, regardless of their birth or circumstances." He paused. "And because I wanted you to know that I heard you, Margaret. Everything you said about possibility and potential and hope, I heard you." I turned to face him then, and the expression in his eyes made my breath catch. "Your mother was right, Edward. We cannot what? Cannot be friends? Cannot work together towards something we both believe in? You know it is more than friendship." "Yes," he said simply, "I know. I have known since the first day I watched you teach, when I saw the care and passion you brought to these children, when I saw how you looked at them as though each one mattered immensely. I have tried to stay away as you asked, Margaret, but I cannot. I do not want to. What you want does not matter. What I want does not matter. There are rules, expectations. Then perhaps it is time to question those rules." He took a step closer. "I am not asking you for anything improper. I am simply asking if I might continue to visit the school, to see you, to talk with you. Is that so terrible?" It was terrible because it was exactly what I wanted, because every moment near him made it harder to remember all the reasons we should stay apart. But I was tired of being alone, tired of denying what I felt. "You may visit," I said finally, "but Edward, you must understand, nothing can come of this. Your mother will never accept, society will never accept it, and I will not be the cause of your estrangement from your family. Let me worry about my family," he said gently. "For now, can we simply be together, as we were before?" I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he smiled with such relief and joy that I felt my resolution waver. We fell into a new pattern after that, one that was both torture and bliss. Edward came to the school 3 or 4 times a week, always proper, always careful not to touch me in ways that might provoke gossip. But there were moments when our hands brushed reaching for the same book, when he helped me with my coat and his fingers lingered at my shoulders, when our eyes met across the schoolroom and held for beats too long. That made it clear to anyone paying attention that we were not merely colleagues. The villagers began to talk, of course. Mrs. Shaw mentioned it carefully one evening as I was preparing my lessons, saying only that people were noticing Mr. Harrington's frequent visits, that questions were being asked. I knew I should care more, should be more concerned about my reputation, but I found I could not regret the time with Edward, whatever the cost might be. He began bringing me books from his family's library, volumes I could never have afforded on my salary. We would discuss them during our walks after school, debating philosophy and poetry as equals, and I discovered that he valued my opinions, challenged my thinking, treated me as an intellectual companion in a way I had never experienced. One evening in March, as we walked along the river path where the first signs of spring were beginning to show in the hedgerows, he told me about his life, about the expectations that had been placed on him since birth. "I am meant to marry Arabella Thornton," he said, his voice flat. "My mother has been planning it since we were children. Arabella is suitable in every way. Her family is old and wealthy. She has been trained from birth to manage a great household, and she understands society's demands." "Then perhaps you should marry her," I said, though the words felt like stones in my mouth. "I do not love her. I do not even particularly like her. She is vapid and cruel, interested only in fashion and gossip. But my mother insists, and my father, though he is kinder than she, believes I should do my duty to the family. What do you believe?" He stopped walking and turned to face me, reaching out to take my hands in his. It was the first time he had truly touched me beyond the most casual contact, and I felt the warmth of his hands through my thin gloves. "I believe," he said slowly, "that a man should marry where his heart leads him. I believe that compatibility of mind and spirit matters more than compatibility of bank account. I believe that you, Margaret Collins, are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and that I am half mad with loving you." I should have pulled my hands away. I should have reminded him of all the obstacles, all the reasons this was impossible. Instead, I stood there in the fading light, with tears streaming down my face, and whispered, "I love you too." He kissed me then, softly and carefully, as though I were something precious that might break. It was my first kiss, and it was everything and nothing like I had imagined, sweeter and more frightening and more real. When we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, and we stood there breathing together while the river murmured beside us and the last birds of day called overhead. "I will speak to my father," he said. "I will make him understand. He will never agree. Your mother will make certain of that. Then I will choose you over their approval. Edward, no. I will not let you sacrifice your family, your inheritance, your entire future for me. The guilt would destroy us both. What future do I have without you? Marrying a woman I do not love? Living a life that has no meaning beyond maintaining appearances?" He pulled back enough to look into my eyes. "I have thought about this, Margaret. I have thought about little else. There will be difficulties, yes, but we can face them together." I wanted to believe him. I wanted it so desperately that it frightened me. But I had lived long enough in poverty to know what it meant to be without resources, without family support, and I could not bear the thought of dragging him down into that precarious existence. "Let me speak to my father first," he said, sensing my hesitation. "Let me at least try before we despair." I agreed, though I held little hope. We walked back to my lodgings in silence, hands clasped together, and I tried to memorize everything about that moment, the feel of his hand in mine, the sound of his breathing, the way the lamplight caught in his hair, because I feared it might be the last time we could be together like this. The next 3 weeks were agony. Edward sent me notes, saying only that he was in discussions with his father, that the matter was complicated, that I should be patient. I threw myself into my teaching and into preparing the scholarship applications with Thomas, Mary, and a third student named James Keller, who showed remarkable aptitude for mathematics. The children's excitement about the scholarships was one of the few lights in those dark days. Then one morning in early April, Edward arrived at the school with his father. Lord Harrington's face was grave but not unkind, and he asked if he might speak with me privately. Edward waited outside with the children while his father and I sat in the small room I used as an office. "Miss Collins," Lord Harrington began, "my son has spoken to me at length about his feelings for you. He has also spoken very highly of your work here and your character. My lord, I would never presume—" He held up a hand. "Please, let me finish. Edward has told me that he wishes to marry you, and that if I do not give my consent, he will do so anyway and accept whatever consequences follow." My heart sank. "My lord, I have told him this is impossible. The differences between us are significant, yes. My wife is vehemently opposed to any such match. She has made it clear that she will never accept you, never receive you socially, never acknowledge any children you might have." He paused, his expression troubled. "I will be honest with you, Miss Collins. This marriage would cause a scandal. It would damage Edward's position in society, possibly end his political ambitions, certainly create a rift in our family." "Then you see why it cannot happen." "I see why it should not happen," he corrected gently. "But I also see something else. I see that my son, who has always done his duty without complaint, who has never asked for anything for himself, is truly in love for the first time in his life. And I see that the woman he loves is intelligent, principled, and genuinely good, all qualities I would wish for in a daughter-in-law, regardless of her birth." I stared at him, unable to speak. "I have thought a great deal about this," he continued, "about what matters most in life. I married Edward's mother because it was expected of me, because our families were suitable matches. We have had a civil enough marriage, but I cannot say it has been happy. I do not wish that for my son." He leaned forward, his eyes searching my face. "If you love him, Miss Collins, if you truly love him and will make him happy, then you have my blessing to marry him. But your wife, my wife will have to accept it. It will take time, but she will come around eventually, particularly if you give her grandchildren. In the meantime, I will settle a property on you both, something separate from the main estate, where you can establish your own household. It is not as grand as Harrington Hall, but it is comfortable, and it comes with sufficient income that you will not want for necessities." I felt dizzy, as though the world had tilted beneath me. "Why would you do this?" "Because I have seen what your school has accomplished, because I believe in the work you are doing, and because I have watched my son these past months, and I have never seen him so alive, so purposeful as when he is with you." He smiled slightly. "Also, if I am being entirely honest, I rather like the idea of having a daughter-in-law who challenges my wife's assumptions. It will do her good." He left me there, stunned, and sent Edward in. One look at Edward's face told me he already knew his father's decision. He crossed the small room in 3 strides and pulled me into his arms, and I let myself collapse against him, all my carefully maintained control finally breaking. "He said yes," I whispered against his shoulder. "He actually said yes. Did you think he would not? He is a better man than my mother, always has been." Edward pulled back to look at me, his hands framing my face. "Margaret, will you marry me? Properly, formally, so that there can be no doubt?" "Yes," I said, and then again, "Yes, yes," until he stopped my words with a kiss. We were married 6 weeks later in the village church, with only Edward's father, a few friends, and the entire school in attendance. Lady Harrington refused to come, but I found I could not regret her absence on what was otherwise the happiest day of my life. I wore a simple cream-colored dress that Edward had insisted on buying for me, and Thomas Fletcher and Mary Dawson stood up with us as witnesses, both of them beaming with pride. Lord Harrington gave me away, and as he placed my hand in Edward's, he whispered, "Be happy, my dear." That is all I ask. The property Edward's father had settled on us was a beautiful manor house called Ashfield, about 10 miles from Harrington Hall, with extensive grounds and a small tenant farm. It was larger than anything I had ever dreamed of living in. Yet Edward immediately began making plans to convert one wing into a proper school. "We will bring the children here," he explained as we walked through the empty rooms a week after our wedding. "We will have proper classrooms, a library, space for science experiments and art. We will expand the scholarship program, bringing in students from across the region. You will not be alone in teaching. We will hire additional instructors, people who share your philosophy." "It will be expensive," I said, though I could not keep the excitement from my voice. "My father has agreed to help fund it initially, and I have some money of my own from investments. Once we can demonstrate results, I believe we can attract other donors." He turned to me, his eyes bright. "This can be a model, Margaret. We can show that education works, that it changes lives regardless of class or background. We can prove that your way is right." We spent that first summer transforming Ashfield, and I had never been happier. Edward worked alongside the carpenters and painters, as likely to be found in shirt sleeves covered in dust as in his fine clothes. We designed the classrooms together, arguing cheerfully about the placement of windows and the size of desks, about which books to purchase for the library, and how to organize the curriculum. The first students arrived in September, 15 children from mining families, including Thomas, Mary, and James from my original school, along with 12 others who had been awarded scholarships or whose families could pay modest fees. We hired 2 additional teachers, both women who had struggled to find positions because of their gender, and one of the tenant farmers agreed to teach agricultural science. Lady Harrington maintained her distance, but Lord Harrington visited often, taking genuine pleasure in watching the school develop. He brought other wealthy men to see what we were doing, and slowly we began to attract additional funding. By the end of the first year, we had 25 students and plans to expand further. Edward threw himself into the work with passion I had not known he possessed. He taught classes in history and literature, helped students with their studies, and spent his evenings writing articles about education reform that were sometimes published in London newspapers. He was happier than I had ever seen him, and our love, rather than diminishing with the challenges of daily life, only grew deeper and stronger. We had been married nearly 2 years when Lady Harrington finally came to visit. I was in one of the classrooms helping a student with Latin when Edward found me, his expression strained. "My mother is here," he said quietly. "She wishes to speak with you." I felt my stomach clench with anxiety, but I straightened my spine and followed him to the drawing room. Lady Harrington stood by the window, perfectly dressed as always, her face as cold and composed as I remembered. "Miss Collins," she said, then corrected herself with visible effort. "Margaret, I suppose I must call you that now, as you are my daughter-in-law. Lady Harrington, this is an unexpected pleasure, is it? I rather doubt that." She turned from the window to face me fully. "I will be direct, as I have no talent for false courtesy. I came here today because my husband insisted, because he believes it is time I acknowledged this marriage and your existence. I do not approve of you. I likely never will. You are not what I wanted for my son." I said nothing, simply waited. "However," she continued, her voice slightly softer, "I have been watching from a distance. I have read the articles about your school. I have heard from others about the work you are doing here, about the children you are helping, and I have seen my son, who was dutiful but unhappy before he met you, become someone who seems to have found genuine purpose." She paused, and I saw something flicker in her cold eyes that might have been respect. "My husband tells me I am a fool to let pride keep me from knowing my son and his family. He tells me I will regret it if I continue this way." She drew a breath. "I do not know if I can ever truly accept you, Margaret, but I am willing to try for Edward's sake, and for the sake of any grandchildren you might eventually provide." It was not a warm welcome, not an embrace or an apology, but it was a beginning, and that was more than I had hoped for. "Thank you, Lady Harrington," I said quietly. "That means a great deal to both of us." She stayed for tea, speaking mostly to Edward, asking about the school in a tone that was more curious than critical. When she left, she nodded to me with something that was almost civility, and I saw Edward's shoulders relax with relief. That night, as we lay in bed in the comfortable room that was ours alone, Edward pulled me close and kissed the top of my head. "I told you it would work out," he said. "You were more optimistic than the circumstances warranted. I had faith in us. That was all I needed." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Are you happy, Margaret? Truly happy?" I thought about my life, about the school where children like Thomas and Mary and James were receiving educations that would open doors previously locked to them, about the work Edward and I were doing together, about the home we had built, about the love we shared. "I am happier than I ever imagined possible," I said, and it was nothing but truth. The years that followed brought challenges, certainly. Not everyone approved of what we were doing, and there were those who thought it dangerous to educate the poor beyond their station. But gradually, our school gained a reputation for excellence, and other reformers began to cite us as proof that education could transcend class boundaries. We expanded Ashfield twice more, eventually accommodating over 100 students. Some of our early graduates went on to universities, others became teachers themselves, spreading our philosophy to other regions. Thomas Fletcher, despite his clubfoot, became a brilliant mathematician and eventually a professor at Cambridge. Mary Dawson became a physician, one of the first women to do so, and returned often to lecture our students about science and possibility. Lady Harrington never became warm, but she did become cordial, particularly after our first child was born, a daughter we named Sarah. She saw in Sarah the continuation of the Harrington line, and that mattered enough to her that she made a genuine effort to bridge the gap between us. Edward's father lived long enough to see the school flourish into something beyond what any of us had initially imagined. On his deathbed, he told Edward that watching us build Ashfield had been one of the great joys of his later years, that he had never regretted giving his blessing to our marriage. And Edward himself, my Edward, remained my partner in every sense through all of it. We taught together, planned together, dreamed together. We raised our 3 children to understand that privilege came with responsibility, that education was a gift to be shared, not hoarded. We grew old together, our love deepening with each passing year, each challenge faced, each victory won. Sometimes, when I watch him now across one of our classrooms, his hair gone silver and his face lined but his eyes still as bright as they were that first day in my small village school, I remember the girl I was, poor, uncertain, convinced that love was not for someone like me. And I think about how wrong I was, how love can come from the most unexpected places, how it can transform not just 2 lives, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, through the ripples it creates. We did not have an easy path, Edward and I. We faced opposition, judgment, difficulty, but we had each other, and we had a shared purpose, and that was enough, more than enough. If this story touched your heart, I would love to know. And I hope you'll stay for more quiet tales of love that found a way.